Karen Anderson sat in silence in her cold cell. Her final hours were slipping away, and the electric chair waited for her, the weight of her fate pressing down on her. At 60, she looked as though she had lived 100 years. Her grey hair hung loosely around her shoulders, and her wrinkled hands trembled ever so slightly. Outside, the heavy clank of metal doors echoed through the hallway, mingling with the steady footsteps of the guards. But, in Karen's mind, time had slowed to a halt. Once, she had lived a quiet, unremarkable life, nearly invisible to those around her. She had resided in a modest neighborhood where the days passed in quiet solitude. That all changed the day her crime made national headlines. Karen Anderson had kidnapped a 3-year-old boy, a child with wide, innocent eyes and a sweet smile. His face was on the front page of every newspaper, and Karen was painted as a monster in the public's eye. No one knew the details of what had truly happened, but everyone was certain of the outcome. She had been caught and condemned to die. As the minutes dragged on in her cold cell, the sound of the iron door unlocking sent a jolt through her heart. 2 guards entered, their faces emotionless, like they had done this 100 times before. "It's time," one of them said, his voice gravelly, devoid of sympathy. Karen knew what that meant. Her time had come. The electric chair was merciless and cold. Her legs, weak from fear, almost gave out beneath her, but she forced herself to stand. Every step toward that final destination felt heavier than the last. As she walked the narrow corridor, memories from her past began to flood her mind. She saw the child's face, the little boy she had taken. But why? What had driven her to commit such an unspeakable act? No one had ever cared to hear her side of the story. They had judged her and sentenced her, and now she was about to pay the ultimate price. The guards marched her forward with unyielding resolve, but as they moved, she caught something unusual in the eyes of one of them, a flicker of doubt, maybe even compassion. For the first time, Karen wondered if someone deep down questioned the certainty of her guilt. Was it possible? Was she really the monster everyone thought she was? But it was too late for second thoughts now. The long walk down death row was coming to its end, just as Karen's life was. The corridor felt endless, its grey walls swallowing all traces of warmth or humanity. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows across the cold, hard floor. The clanking of the chains on Karen's ankles echoed through the hall, mingling with the distant hum of the generator, powering the dreadful machine that awaited her. Each step was a struggle. Each second was a torment. Her mind whirled with thoughts like dead leaves blown in a gust of wind. She felt the full weight of what was about to happen. But beneath it all, a quiet doubt stirred. Did she truly deserve this? Did the world really know the whole story? "Keep moving!" barked the taller guard, his voice sharp as the chill in the air. Karen obeyed, but her mind wandered far away. She remembered things buried deep in time memories that few would ever know. The child, the little 3-year-old boy. None of it was his fault. His innocent face flashed in her mind and Karen's heart tightened. But despite the overwhelming pain, she knew something nobody else ever understood. Before she could sink deeper into her memories, reality yanked her back. The corridor was ending. Ahead of her loomed a heavy metal door, guarded by 2 officers standing rigid as statues. Behind that door waited the electric chair, the end. A weight of dread pressed against her chest, like invisible hands squeezing her heart. It was a fear that only those staring death in the face could comprehend. "Wait here," one of the guards said, his voice softer than she expected, almost compassionate. She stood frozen, just a few feet from the door that marked the end of her road. The silence around her was suffocating. In that moment, Karen wanted to scream, to shout out to the world the truth of what had really happened. But who would believe her now? It was too late. Even so, as her gaze fixed on that cold metal door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Why her? So many secrets lay buried in the dark corners of this story, truths no one ever uncovered. She wasn't entirely innocent, she knew that. But the whole truth lay hidden in the shadows of her past. A past no one had ever bothered to examine. The guard on the right pulled out a ring of keys, unlocking the heavy door with a screech that made Karen's stomach twist. The sound of the door creaking open was like a death knell. There it was, the execution chamber. The room itself was cold, lifeless. At the center stood the electric chair, towering like a grim sentinel, wrapped in a tangle of gleaming wires. This was the chair where so many others had already met their fate. The atmosphere was thick with a chilling silence, and Karen felt a shiver run down her spine. As she stepped inside, her legs wobbled. The guards had to hold her steady, but her feet barely felt the ground beneath her. The world around her seemed to move in slow motion, and it became harder to catch her breath. Each second in that room was pure mental torture. There were only a handful of people in attendance: the prison warden, 2 officers, and a priest. They all stood in their designated spots, ready to witness the final moments. But it was the priest's gaze that made Karen pause. His eyes were kind, almost as if he could see past the surface to the pain and the truth she had never shared. "Is there anything you want to confess, my child?" the priest asked, his gentle voice breaking the deadly silence. Karen hesitated, the words lodged in her throat. What could she possibly say now that would change anything? But something deep within her demanded to be spoken, as if the truth was burning to escape. I did it for a reason," she began, her voice trembling, barely audible. He was in danger. I had no choice." The priest's eyes flickered with understanding for a brief moment, while the others in the room exchanged skeptical glances. Karen knew no one would believe her. Not now. But still, she had to say it. It was all she had left. She tried to continue, but her words were cut off by the guard approaching with the straps. Time was running out, and all that remained was despair and silence. Karen sat, her frail body bound to the cold leather straps of the electric chair. The guards moved with practiced precision, tightening the restraints around her wrists and ankles as if they had done it countless times before. Every motion was mechanical, efficient, lacking any semblance of empathy. To them, she was no more than another case, another body in a long line of bodies waiting for judgment. But to Karen, each tightening of the straps felt like a blow to her soul, a reminder that the world had already deemed her guilty, unworthy of mercy. A shiver crept down her spine as her eyes swept the room, searching for something that might offer a sliver of humanity. But there was none. The faces around her were cold, detached, filled with the certainty of her fate. Nearby, a priest stood, his hands trembling as they held a rosary. His gaze found hers, and for just a fleeting moment, Karen felt less alone. His eyes, filled with a kind of quiet compassion, reminded her that not everyone saw her as a monster. "Is there anything you want to say, child?" he asked softly, his voice barely a whisper. Karen longed to speak, to scream out the truth that had been locked inside her for so long, but the words lodged in her throat. What was the point? They had already made up their minds. To them, she was the woman who stole a child, who tore a family apart and caused untold pain. But what if they knew? What if they understood what she had seen that day? the boy. She could see him clearly now, his wide, frightened eyes, his little face twisted in fear. He was in danger, though no one had ever bothered to ask what had really happened. The memory of his mother, a woman respected by everyone in the town, surfaced in her mind. But no one knew what went on behind the closed doors of that house. A single tear slipped down Karen's wrinkled cheek. It was too late for tears, but still, she couldn't stop it. She had never meant to hurt anyone. In fact, the pain that gnawed at her now wasn't for herself, but for the boy, for what he might have endured if she hadn't done what she did. "They don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The priest leaned closer, straining to hear her fragile voice. "What don't they understand, my child?" he asked, his tone gentle, full of concern. Karen closed her eyes, the weight of these final hours pressing down on her. The room was freezing, but inside a storm of emotions burned fiercely, overwhelming her thoughts. She replayed everything she had done, every choice she had made. Has it been worth it? She wasn't sure. The world could judge her, could condemn her, but deep down she knew the truth. It was buried beneath layers of fear, secrets, and silence, untouched by those who had labeled her a villain. The guards finished their task, strapping her tightly to the chair. One of them gestured to the man by the control panel. Karen knew the end was coming. The hum of the electricity preparing in the background buzzed like a dark omen. Every second brought her closer to that inevitable moment. But in those final moments, Karen didn't feel fear. She felt wronged. She knew she wasn't perfect, but she wasn't the monster everyone believed her to be. That truth was one that no one would ever hear. Suddenly the door to the execution chamber swung open, shattering the heavy silence. A middle-aged woman entered, followed by a man in a suit. They were part of the legal team, here to ensure that the sentence would be carried out without a hitch. The woman looked at Karen with a cold, detached gaze, as though she were merely witnessing another routine procedure. "Is everything ready?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the prisoner. "Yes," the guard by the control panel replied. Karen glanced at them both. Her eyes, though heavy with sorrow and weariness, still held a glimmer of light. She wasn't about to beg for mercy. She wouldn't plead for her life to be spared. What was left to save, anyway? Yet, in her silence, there was something far more powerful than words could convey. "I did what I did because he needed me," she said, her voice steady, surprising even herself. It wasn't to hurt anyone, it was to save him. The woman from the legal team exchanged a quick glance with the man standing beside her. No one spoke. The world had stopped listening to Karen Anderson long ago. Her words were little more than echoes, lost in the void. She understood now that there would be no more arguments, no more defenses. Her life would be erased in a matter of minutes, as if it had never mattered at all. But that child. She had done what she believed was right, for him. The guard approached with the black hood in hand, holding it like an executioner about to fulfill his role. The sight of it twisted Karen's stomach. That hood would wipe away the last vestiges of her humanity. Once it covered her face, she would no longer be Karen Anderson, the woman who had fought to protect a child. She would simply become another number in the long list of the condemned. She closed her eyes as the hood was pulled over her head. Darkness swallowed her entirely, and the sounds around her began to fade as if she were sinking into deep water. For a fleeting moment her thoughts returned to the boy. What had become of him? Was he safe now? Was he far from danger? Or had it all been in vain? No one knew. And no one cared. And in that terrifying silence, Karen Anderson felt something unexpected. She had done what she believed was right even if the world had judged her for it. And now her journey was nearing its end. The hum of wires being connected and the quiet murmurs of those in the room were the only sounds left. The button was about to be pressed, and then everything would vanish. The black hood, tight against her face, muffled the noises around her. The buzz of the room now seemed distant, and the complete darkness wrapped her like a grim embrace. She knew there wasn't much time left, but as she waited for the final moment, something deep within her urged her to focus on one last memory, a fragment of truth that for some reason still burned bright in her heart. It was the boy again. That grey afternoon when everything changed. She found him alone, trembling with fear in a house that should have been his safe haven, but instead was a place of torment. Memories flooded back in sharp, fleeting fragments like scenes from a nightmare. The heavy thud of footsteps on the stairs, muffled cries, and the ominous shadow of a dark figure. She knew there was nowhere to run. That's when Karen made her decision, without a moment's hesitation, driven only by the urgency of the moment. She took the child with her, away from that place, away from the looming danger. But what nobody knew, what had never been told, was the real reason behind her actions. She hadn't kidnapped the boy out of cruelty. She had saved him. Or at least, that's what she believed. Inside the execution chamber, the guards exchanged impatient glances. The order to proceed with the execution hadn't come yet, and they were eager to get the job done. The legal woman standing nearby was meticulously reviewing the documents, ensuring every detail of the process was in order. The man beside her glanced awkwardly at his wristwatch, clearly irritated by the delay. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the hallway. Quick footsteps. Someone was rushing toward the chamber. Even though Karen Anderson sat under the suffocating hood, she could sense the shift in the room. Something was happening. The door flew open, and a young officer, Lucas, breathless and clutching a thick folder, burst into the room. He seemed disoriented, as if he had been racing against time. All eyes turned toward him. The legal woman furrowed her brow, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "It's new evidence," the officer managed to gasp, still catching his breath. "You need to see this before going any further. It's urgent." A heavy silence settled over the room. The guards hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure of what to do. The tension was thick, like the entire fate of the room hung in the balance of that very moment. Even in the dark, Karen felt a faint spark of hope flicker in her chest. Evidence? What could that mean? The legal woman snatched the folder from Lucas's hands and began flipping through the pages with a furrowed brow. As she read, her expression shifted, confusion and disbelief growing with each passing minute. After what felt like an eternity, she slammed the folder shut, frustration tightening her voice. "This should have been here sooner," she muttered, her tone laced with anger. "We have to stop this. We can't proceed with the execution right now." Karen Anderson's heart skipped a beat. Stop the execution? How could that be possible? She had been moments away from death, and now, suddenly, new evidence emerged that might save her life. The guards, still unsure, waited for further instructions. But would the truth finally come to light? And if it did, what would the world do with that truth? She couldn't predict it. A fragile hope lingered in the air, slim, but hope nonetheless. The clock kept ticking, and the sense that something far bigger was on the horizon kept her awake. Maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. Karen Anderson watched as the shadows danced on the walls, cast by the dim light filtering through the bars. The death row corridor, which once seemed like a one-way path to oblivion, now felt like a mysterious road full of unanswered questions. The postponement of her execution brought with it an unsettling restlessness. Why had these new pieces of evidence come to light so suddenly? And what might they reveal about her and the child? Sitting in the darkest corner of her cell, her wrinkled fingers clutched the small pendant hanging around her neck. It was the only possession they had allowed her to keep, the last link to a past she could not fully escape. The pendant had once belonged to the boy. When she had found him that fateful afternoon, he had clutched it so tightly, his small fingers nearly left marks on the metal. Karen had held onto it ever since, even after everything had happened. The medal belonged to the boy. When Karen Anderson found him that fateful grey afternoon, his small fingers had clung to it so tightly, it was as if he had tried to imprint his fear into the cold metal. Even after everything that had happened, she had never let go of that medal. It was her one connection to the past. The hours in her cell dragged by, painfully slow, and the coldness of the room felt sharper than usual, chilling her to the bone. Left alone with her thoughts, Karen found herself haunted by memories she had long tried to bury. Memories no one else knew. That boy wasn't just any boy. He was the son of a dangerous man, a shadowy figure who had threatened everyone around him. The boy's mother, a desperate woman who had once sought Karen's help, had vanished without a trace shortly after pleading for her son's life. No one knew the real reason Karen had taken the child away that day. The court never bothered to hear that part of the story. All they saw was a cruel woman who had snatched a defenseless child from his family. No one wanted to hear her side. As these memories flooded back, the sharp clink of footsteps in the hallway pulled her back to the present. The door to her cell creaked open, and in the dim light stood a familiar face, Lucas, who had interrupted her execution. His anxious look was gone now, replaced by a calm determination, as though something had shifted within him. "I need to speak with you, Karen Anderson," he said, his voice softer than it had been before. "I don't have much time, but I need to know the truth. What really happened with the boy? Now." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Could she trust him? After all, trusting others was what had led her here, to death row. But there was something about him. Maybe it was the urgency in his voice, or the way he looked at her that made her consider speaking. "You won't believe me," Karen began, her voice hoarse with the weight of time. No one ever did. He stepped closer, sitting on the edge of the hard, cold bed, leaning in as though every word she said mattered. "I found those files," he said quietly. "Maybe you don't know, but I'm not the only one who's starting to question what was said about you. There are things that don't add up. The more I dig, the more questions arise." Karen sighed deeply, feeling the familiar heaviness settle in her chest. For years, no one had listened. But here was this young man, eager to hear the story she had kept locked away. And so, she began. "It started long before the kidnapping," she whispered, her eyes distant. "I knew the boy's mother. She was trapped in an abusive relationship with a powerful man, a man who had his hands in everything dirty and dangerous. I saw the trouble, but I never thought I'd get pulled into it. It wasn't until the boy was born that things got unbearable. His mother. She was scared for her life." Karen paused, her voice trembling slightly. "She begged me to take him away," she said, staring at the floor. "So I did. But no one ever saw that. No one wanted to hear the truth. Lucas sat in silence, processing her words, but his face betrayed a deeper understanding. He knew more than she had expected. "Karen Anderson," he said slowly, carefully choosing his next words. "When I found those new documents, a name kept coming up. A name that was wiped from the official trial records. You knew who was behind this, didn't you? The boy's father. That's why you did what you did, isn't it?" Karen lifted her head, her eyes widening in surprise. "Who is it?" Her voice came out weaker than she'd expected. He hesitated for a moment, but then, finally, the words came. His father, the man behind it all. The one no one ever mentioned in court, someone with enough power to pull strings none of us can see. The silence that followed was suffocating. Karen swallowed hard, feeling a flood of painful memories and long-buried fears surge through her. She knew exactly who he was. But speaking the truth about him would drag her into something far more dangerous. If she spoke out, she feared she wouldn't live to see the next day, not from the electric chair, but from something worse. "If I tell you everything," she began, her voice trembling, "they won't let me live. No one will." Lucas's expression grew more serious. He understood the weight of what he was asking her to do. He realized this frail woman, standing on the edge of death, was holding secrets that could bring down powerful men. Yet still, he needed the truth. "This could be our last chance, Karen Anderson," he said, almost pleading. "Yours and that boy's." She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment, haunted by the image of the boy clutching his small medal and the terror etched on his mother's face. Maybe the time had come for everything to come out, but she knew the truth could either save them all or destroy everything. Opening her eyes again, she stared at Lucas. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment she had to make her choice. And she understood, deep down, that whatever she decided would change everything. The heavy silence in the cell hung between them after Karen Anderson's words. Lucas watched her closely, waiting, hoping she'd finally reveal the secret everyone seemed so desperate to ignore. For her part, she felt the crushing weight of decades of lies, omissions, and silences pressing down on her. Telling the truth now could shift the entire course of things, but it could also seal her fate in a way even more brutal than the chair she was bound for. She wasn't just up against a courtroom. She was up against powers far greater than any judge or jury. Powers that had the ability to erase anyone who dared speak out. "He won't let this go," Karen whispered, breaking the silence, her voice barely more than a breath. "The boy's father. He has eyes and ears everywhere. If I speak, neither of us will be safe." The officer gave her a faint smile, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He understood the risks, but what he had uncovered in the past few weeks had pushed him to have this conversation with her now. There was something bigger here, something far darker, and the key to unraveling it all was right in front of him, held in the hands of this weathered woman, worn by life and time. "Karen Anderson," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know you're scared, but I also know you're not the person the papers made you out to be. I've read about your life before all this. You were a nurse. You cared for children. You helped mothers. You aren't a kidnapper. You saved that boy, didn't you?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted around the cell, searching her memories for the right words. What he said was true. She had never been a criminal. But what happens when you do something wrong for the right reasons? "I did what I thought was right," she finally said, her voice cracking with emotion. But no one wanted to hear that. They only saw what they wanted to see, a lonely old woman with no family and a child that wasn't hers. They turned me into a monster. And the boy's father? The officer pressed gently. What does he have to do with all of this? Karen closed her eyes, trying to keep the whirlwind of memories from overwhelming her. The father, a man cloaked in power, with deep connections in politics and business, always operating in the shadows, always unseen by the public eye. When the boy was born, he showed no interest. But the moment he learned that Karen had taken him, everything changed. His pursuit wasn't driven by love or paternal concern. No, he sought control over what the boy's mother knew, secrets that could ruin his carefully built reputation and possibly land him behind bars. Karen began to speak, feeling the weight of her words settle like stones. He never cared for his son. To him, the boy was just a pawn, the mother. She knew something that could bring him down. That's why he silenced her. That's why I had to take the boy. The officer's eyes widened in shock. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. A powerful man, dangerous secrets, and a conspiracy designed to silence those who dared to know too much. He was stepping into something far beyond his control. But there was no turning back now. He had to see it through to the end. What did she know? He asked, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. Things he's done. Things no one would believe him capable of, Karen replied, her voice low. The boy's mother tried to escape, but she never had a chance, and I tried to save him. I tried to protect that child. The officer watched her more closely now, every word adding another layer of tension to the already dark and twisted story. He was beginning to see that this wasn't just a simple kidnapping. It was part of a much larger game, one involving power, corruption, and secrets no one wanted revealed. What was buried so deep that you've been left here to die in silence? He asked, his voice quieter now. What happened to the boy? Karen fell silent. The weight of the truth was crushing, pressing down on her. She knew what had happened to the child, but to speak it aloud would mean confronting her worst nightmares. He's gone, she finally whispered, her eyes filling with tears. That night, when everything fell apart, they took him from me. The officer shot up from his chair, his mind racing. The boy had disappeared, and the public had never been told. Was the trial nothing more than a show, a smokescreen to hide something far more sinister? That wasn't in the reports, he muttered, half to himself, half to her. They covered it up, Karen said, her gaze locking onto his. They've hidden a lot of things, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep it that way. The air in the cell grew thick with tension. Each revelation sent a chill down the officer's spine, as if they were stepping into dangerous territory with every word spoken. He knew he was getting close to something huge, but he also knew that going any further would cost him more than just his job. It might cost him his life. You have to get me out of here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. If you want the whole truth, you need to get me out before they kill me. The officer drew a deep breath, the weight of responsibility heavy on his chest. Karen Anderson wasn't just another prisoner on death row. She knew more than anyone could have guessed. And now he had to make a choice. Trust her and risk everything, or walk away and let the system carry on with its charade. Deep down, he knew what his decision had to be. But it was a choice that would change the course of his life and the lives of everyone entangled in this web of lies. The tension inside the prison felt suffocating. Every second passed like a drumbeat hammering against Karen's chest. the final countdown of someone who knew her time was nearly up. Lucas stepped out of her cell, but Karen could see the change in his eyes. He now carried the burden of the truth, and that weight could either break him or turn him into something more, someone who could alter the course of fate. Hours passed. Karen was left alone, trapped with her thoughts and painful memories. The distant echo of guards' footsteps and the chilling quiet of death row stirred an ancient fear within her, a fear of losing all control. Yet there was one thing she had never told anyone, a secret she had buried so deeply. She had even hidden it from herself, a last defense against the nightmare that had always loomed. She gazed around her cell, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, and drew in a deep breath. The cold smell of metal and dampness surrounded her. The weight of her age and the long passage of time pressed down harder than ever before. Why hadn't she run when she had the chance? Why had she stayed, knowing the system was stacked against her? Because deep down, Karen always knew that running would have only made things worse. The shadows that followed her would have caught up with her, no matter where she went. She wasn't just running from a powerful man, but from a darker, deeper truth. A truth that now threatened to engulf everything. The cell door creaked open, and Lucas entered again. His face was pale, but his eyes held a determination that hadn't been there before. "Karen Anderson," he began, standing rather than sitting this time. "I've gone over the reports, spoken with a few people, and found something that's been hidden from the start." She remained silent, watching him closely. She could sense that the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. "The boy," he continued. "He was never found. The official reports claimed he was rescued and returned to his family. But that didn't happen, did it?" Karen closed her eyes, feeling the sting of tears well up behind her lids. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "They never found him. They took him that night. I heard his screams. I tried to fight them off, but there were too many. They took him to make sure I stayed silent. They knew that without him, I had no proof to defend myself." The officer shook his head, clenching his fists. Everything was starting to make sense now, the rushed trial, the fabricated evidence, the way the case had been so swiftly covered up. It had all been orchestrated from the beginning. "And the boy's father?" he asked, trying to piece together the role of the man Karen feared so much. "He never cared about his son," she answered, her voice trembling. "All he wanted was to erase every trace of the boy's mother because she knew too much. She knew about his crimes, the filth he hid behind his wealth and influence. When she tried to escape, he hunted her down like an animal. But she managed to ask for my help, and I was the only one who could step in." Karen's body shook as the memories of that night came flooding back. The frantic race to save the boy, the terror of being caught. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. She couldn't escape the boy's father's watchful eyes. He didn't send his men to rescue his child. He sent them to bury the truth about his crimes, once and for all. Lucas hung on her every word, fully aware now of the danger that was far closer than he'd realized. There was no doubt left Karen wasn't guilty of kidnapping. She was being punished for something far greater than her actions. She knew too much, and that sealed her fate. "So, what do we do now?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "I can't let them kill you for something you didn't do. But I need something more I can use to stop this." He paused, thinking through the impossible options. The entire system was rotten to the core, and to bring it down would mean facing off against powerful enemies. Karen looked deep into his eyes. She knew he wanted to help, but she also knew that in doing so, he'd be putting his own life at risk. Some truths couldn't be revealed without devastating consequences, and she had spent the last several years in prison for exactly that reason. "Son," she said softly, her voice filled with sorrow, "you've already done more for me than anyone else ever has." "Stop! She's innocent!" All eyes turned to him. The guards hesitated, but the procedure was rigid. The head guard shook his head. "We don't have time for last-minute appeals," he said coldly. "The sentence has already been handed down." "But I have evidence," Lucas pressed, his hand trembling as he held a folder thick with documents. "She didn't kidnap that boy. She was protecting him from a powerful man who wanted him dead. The boy's father was behind all of it." The head guard took the folder, examining it with suspicion. Yet something in Lucas's desperate eyes made him pause. Karen watched, a flicker of hope igniting within her, though she knew that even with the evidence in their hands, justice moved slowly. Her time was almost up. "We'll call the governor," the head guard finally said, turning to his team. "But until we hear back, we continue as planned." Karen felt the straps tighten around her as the electrodes were fastened to her head and legs. The officer stood frozen, powerless in the face of a system that prized protocol over truth. The evidence was right there, yet the wheels of bureaucracy turned faster than justice itself. His eyes darted toward the phone on the wall. The head guard began dialing, but time seemed to rush forward with relentless speed. Every second brought Karen closer to an irreversible end. "Please," the officer pleaded, "just a few more minutes." Karen closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She already knew how this would play out. Even if the truth came to light, her life had been marked by years of pain and injustice. But there was still one thing she could do. Eyes shut, she whispered a prayer, hoping that wherever the boy was, he was safe, far from the monster chasing him. The head guard's eyes flicked over the documents. He could sense the weight of what was in front of him, but the minutes were merciless. The countdown had already begun. Suddenly, the phone rang, a sharp, jarring sound that stopped everyone in the room. The head guard answered, the tension so thick it felt like the air might snap. Everyone waited, holding their breath. "Yes, sir," the head guard said gravely into the phone. "Understood." He hung up, turned to his team, and sighed deeply. "The execution is suspended," he announced, his voice weary. Lucas nearly collapsed with relief. He had done it. Karen still had a chance, a sliver of hope that the truth would finally surface, but as they slowly removed the leather straps, binding her to the chair, Karen opened her eyes and smiled with a calm that took everyone by surprise. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft but steady. The man by the control panel slowly withdrew his hands from the switches, nervously watching the legal woman for her next move. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice uncertain, as if lost in the weight of the moment. The woman took a deep breath, turning her gaze toward Lucas, who had brought the documents. "We're going to halt the execution for now," she said, her voice steadier than before. "We need to go over this new information before making any final decisions." The guards, visibly relieved, began undoing the straps that had held Karen Anderson to the electric chair. They removed the black hood from her head, and the sudden brightness in the room momentarily blinded her. As her eyes adjusted to the light, she saw the faces around her. Some looked impatient, others worn down by the long hours. Yet there was something different now, an air of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "I've already fulfilled my purpose." Lucas stared at her, confused. "Karen, you're free. We're going to get you a new trial with the right evidence. The truth will come out." She smiled again, but this time there was a deeper wisdom in her gaze. "I know you did everything you could, and I'm grateful for that. But the truth is, my time has passed." "They might free me," she continued, "but the chains that hold me aren't something anyone can see. I've lived too many years in this prison, and what matters now is that the boy is safe. If the evil has been unmasked, then I've already won. Justice may be slow, but it always finds its way, one way or another." Lucas couldn't hold back his tears. She was right. Even though the system had failed Karen, the truth had finally won out. But her spirit, even with the promise of freedom, had already crossed the threshold between life and death. They helped her to her feet, though her legs wobbled, weak from the strain of everything that had just unfolded. Karen could hardly believe what was happening. For a brief moment, she thought it might all be a mistake, just a temporary delay before they corrected it, and led her back to the chair. But then her eyes met those of Lucas, the one who had brought the evidence. He looked at her with a mix of urgency and empathy. "There's something you haven't told, isn't there?" he asked quietly, as they escorted her back to her cell. "Something that could change everything." Karen remained silent for a few seconds, letting his words sink in. Yes, she whispered to herself. There was something she hadn't shared, something that had eaten away at her, buried deep within her past. But fear had held her back. Fear that even now no one would believe her. Fear that, despite these new pieces of evidence, it might be too late. Karen, from the chair, but she walked as though she had no destination. Lucas walked beside her, guiding her toward the exit of the execution chamber. Before they parted, she looked back at him one last time. "Remember," she said gently, "never let fear or power drown out the truth. Fight for it, even when the whole world is against you." With those words, Karen walked toward the prison's doors, free but at peace. Lucas stood motionless for a moment, staring after her, knowing that his life would never be the same again. Thank you all for following Karen Anderson's gripping and emotional story. Sometimes the truth gets buried beneath fear and power, but as we've seen today, justice finds its way, though it may come later than we hope. Karen's story is a powerful reminder that no matter what, we should never stop seeking and standing up for the truth. If this story touched you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another video where we bring you more compelling, thrilling, and meaningful stories. Also, drop a comment below and tell us, what would you do if you were in Karen's shoes? Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.